So now we have Section 9, which is the evolution of journalism. And we're talking about how journalism really has changed over time, which calls into question, and we'll discuss this in class, what is journalism? And therefore, who is a journalist? And how do these things change? And what's changing them? For several decades after the scare of yellow journalism, I remember that's when we started focusing more on objectivity in reporting. So after that, these standard practices were used to encourage objectivity. We talked about these practices of never quote anything out of context, use inverted pyramid, present both sides of the story. So after that had been around for several decades, journalism had a set standard ethical practices, but people were getting bored with that kind of reading. After a half century, journalists became dissatisfied with having to adhere to those rules, especially if adhering to those rules didn't really tell the full story. And so what we saw new forms of journalism emerge from that. We saw journalists and writers who did not necessarily want objectivity to be the guiding principle of everything. They wanted to feel like they were telling the story more truthfully. And in the 60s and 70s, when we had massive revolutions in a lot of institutions, right? These are the hippie days. There was a wave of reporters and journalists that believed that objectivity was not ultimately achievable, and that journalism wasn't doing enough to improve the status quo. Journalism wasn't being a force for good, it was just telling stories. So writers began injecting more of themselves into their writing. So it started to become a little more subjective. And what we saw is a couple of forms of journalism that come about, and in class I'll show you examples of all these. We have new journalism which comes out, in which writers use literary devices, almost like how you would write a novel. So they use these devices such as thick description, so giving a very, very detailed description of the environment and surroundings. Interior monologue, so in the past, we removed the first person of the reporter. Everything was reported third person, but now this interior monologue is reintroduced. So what is the writer thinking as they're seeing the event unfurl? What is in their head? And then dialogue. How are they having conversations with other people that helped convey the overall story of what's going on? Probably the most noted herald of this time was Hunter S. Thompson, and what he coined to be gonzo journalism, his version of writing. And Hunter S. Thompson was this champion for new journalism and putting yourself more subjectively into the writer's role. Advocacy journalism also pops up. So this is journalism that has unapologetic support for certain issues, right? So what we see is the birth of the editorial, the opinion column, right? Journalism that is taking news and then it's putting its own spin or opinion on it, or it just openly advocates a position. Investigative reporting comes about. Journalism, for the most part, up until this point, had primarily been a reactive endeavor, right? An event happens and a reporter goes to cover it. Some event happens and the reporter after the fact tells the story. So investigative reporting was this acknowledgement that maybe you needed to uncover stories. Maybe someone gave you a tip or a hint on something they thought was occurring. And so instead of waiting for an outcome and the reporter writing that up, investigative reporting was saying, no, go out and uncover that yourself. So you had people who would be reporters, but they would be in disguise, right? Or they would just start digging through information to try to uncover things, taking a proactive approach to newsmaking instead of a reactive. Okay? Service journalism. This comes out of basically a marketing perspective. Is picking stories that they don't seem to be hard news. They're more softer pieces, but they're told because they think that the appeal for that information is great. A lot of times, news stations will put this little tagline: we give you news you can use. News you can use. And that's to say that we're giving you stories that are helpful in your everyday life. Not just telling you what happened throughout the day, but we're giving you information that you can use tomorrow. Precision journalism, sometimes also referred to as computer-assisted reporting. This is where you can use databases and other quantitative methods and statistical information, scientific approach to help you in your reporting. So, and again, this may be also investigative journalism, and I want to make clear of that these categories aren't mutually exclusive. A piece could be a little bit of both. So, for example, if the quality of water, I know I kind of use that example time and time again, but it's something that I think people just take for granted. When they get like their water bill and it has the annual water report of what the chemicals that are in the water. Most of us just kind of pass that off and don't pay attention to it. But what a reporter could do is go to a database or go to some place and figure out what those numbers have been over the past 2 decades or so, and see how the amount of chemicals in the water have changed. Flint, Michigan was having a real problem with all the lead in its water. If someone had been looking more closely at those readings over the years, perhaps some of the problems could have been rectified before they got out of hand. But you're just using quantitative methods, scientific means to dig through and investigate and to determine what's happening in a community. Civic journalism is just this belief that the press should engage citizens and take a role in helping a community set its agenda. It also says civic journalism believes in trying to seek resolution to community issues. So you cover school board meetings or a board of aldermen or city council or whatever, cover mayor's events. And you're just trying to tell citizens what's going on in your community with these government affairs, right? With the hope that it makes you a more informed citizenry, right? You can make better decisions for your community. Citizen journalism is this thing that's kind of popped up more recently with the advent of the internet and blogging and social media. We now all carry around a high-definition camera in our pocket with our cell phones. And those cell phones connect us automatically to social media sites and let us blog and post and share about what we see. So it may be that, a camera crew can't get to the scene of a car accident or a train wreck that quickly, but somebody who was there already at the scene can take video and can talk about what they see, what's occurred, and that becomes part of journalism. And so everyday citizens now become reporters. It's not shocking that this would happen. Throughout history, we've seen that whenever there's some kind of technological leap in communication, that journalism changes as well. For example, when we decide or we discover, rather, how to create pulp paper. So we start figuring out how to generate paper in mass. That's really when you see a birth of newspapers come about. When we start to see an offset press, which is a way to more quickly print a newspaper. You don't have to kind of lock everything down and then create the paper. For example, probably the easiest way to explain offset press is the use of computers in doing layouts for newspapers. Well, once we can start doing that and adjusting things and moving things around more easily, now we see the birth of photojournalism. People can take pictures and put them onto the page as well. We start seeing this birth of alternative newspapers, sometimes papers that are very specific about a certain cultural artifact, like maybe it's about music or fashion or something like that. We start seeing what's called zines pop up primarily because laser printers. So these zines were really small community focused. So, like for example, the punk rock scene in New York, there were a couple of zines that were published that would tell you who are the bands that are playing right now, where are they playing, do interviews with the musicians. Those things were just leaflets and pamphlets created on laser printers, stapled together, and distributed as zines. Blogs come about because of the internet, and the internet is created. So we see that as technology makes it easier for you to communicate and tell stories, we've seen journalism change over time. We talked about a blog and the importance of blogging, and blogging is kind of this ubiquitous term now that kind of represents everything in terms of posting online. But when I say blog, I could just as easily be talking about someone sharing information on social media as well. But traditional blogging, what we saw was that a blog was a website with information updated frequently and presented in reverse chronological order. So you usually saw the newest thing at the top of the web page, right? And each post that somebody will put in there, it could also contain several hyperlinks to other websites, other stories. This evolved over time, and what we saw is what we call news aggregators. In other words, it's websites that don't really write stories themselves. They just collect other stories that are out there online and bring them all into one place. In terms of traditional blogging, though, PETAs.com was one of the first do-it-yourself blogging softwares out there that you could use and post online. Probably the most prominent and popular of the blogging packages or software applications was Blogger.com. It became so powerful and so far-reaching, in fact, that Google purchased it, and now Google basically uses Blogger's structure as its backbone in terms of blogging. So you'll still see this kind of orange icon with a white B, the letter B in the middle of it. That's a reference to Blogger. So when did blogging, I won't necessarily say it's popular, but when it became so popular, but when did it, I guess, start being more credible? It definitely did have a spike in popularity, but it also kind of experienced this shift in credibility, and that was around 9/11. And the problem is you had these news stations, cable news outlets, that knew something was happening but didn't have the story complete. And I'm talking about when the planes first hit the towers. So you had reporters who weren't sure what was going on. And it was hard to get access to officials so that you could say things that you knew were 100% backed. Also, the news stations were kind of only interested in talking to these higher officials, not to the everyday person who was on the street dealing with this as it occurred. And it led to people wanting some kind of immediate access to the human side of the story. People wanted to vent their anger online. They didn't want sterile reporting. In other words, they didn't want an anchor just to get up there and give a recitation of the facts. People wanted to express themselves, and they were able to do that through their blogs. And so people started reading those blogs because it felt like it got them in touch more with the humanity involved in the story. There's no exact count, but there are estimates of how many blogs are out there. In 2015, 28.3 million internet users updated a blog at least once a month. The number of bloggers in the U.S. is set to reach 31.7 million users in 2020. So people telling stories, people going online, this is increasing over time. What has blogging given us? Well, it's given us opinion, in that there's a lot of people that blog news online that are telling us in a rather subjective way their opinion on things. And so they may be giving us news, but they're also giving us their view of the news. Eyewitness testimony. We can talk to people on the ground very quickly now with citizen journalism. Citizens can record video, load it up to a blog, and it can be out there disseminated in a very short amount of time. So it allows us more to view things more as an eyewitness than perhaps in the past. It also will give us stories that are not yet covered by the mainstream. So, you know, a person blogging from the basement of their house, right? Or for a small cell phone company. They don't have to necessarily go by the same guidelines as a large news corporation like a Fox or ABC or CBS or CNN. Their entire credibility, let's say, isn't totally on the line when they get one thing wrong. So what that means is that they can go out and cover stories that maybe there's heavy rumor and heavy gossip going around, but the facts haven't necessarily been confirmed yet. So you may get these breaking stories as they break, as opposed to waiting for the aftermath of the event. And, you know, if CNN consistently gets a story wrong, they're going to be out of a job. Some of these bloggers just kind of shrug off if some of their information is incorrect. So where have we seen this, occur? Well, with Monica Lewinsky, there's a website called The Drudge Report, and I'll have you watch a video from that. But this blogger, basically, Matt Drudge, starts to hear about these stories regarding Lewinsky. And there are several news operations that have also heard these stories, but they haven't confirmed them 100%, so they haven't told anything yet. But Drudge would. And it turns out that he was, for the most part, correct in what he was saying about Lewinsky. WikiLeaks does the same thing where, major news organizations may not report on something because the government doesn't want them to. WikiLeaks can and does report things that perhaps traditional news sources wouldn't have said publicly. So, what does this get us to? How has news changed over time? Well, at its peak, in 1973, there were 63 million subscriptions to a daily paper. 2016, that number's down almost in half at 34 million. Millennials, age 21 to 34, make up about 25% of the U.S. population. They now represent about 24% of the total monthly newspaper readership. So if you think about how millennials are getting their news, the majority, 76%, are not getting it from newspapers. Okay. Also, the highest rated source for TV news is Fox News, which attracts 2.4 million viewers per day. So what I'm saying is that we're shifting further and further away from traditional print. Now, if you look at subscriptions to online versions of paper, they are up over the years, but it is a slow, gradual increase. The slow, gradual increase in online subscriptions has not kept up with the decline in print subscriptions. So newspapers can say that their online division is starting to grow. Unfortunately, their print version is dying. So that will end our talk on how journalism has evolved over the years. It's a short lecture, but there's going to be plenty of video to watch in class. So I look forward to seeing you then.